All right, I suggest that we begin with our webinar. I'm sure some more people will join, but we can already get started because we have a very full program. So welcome to this webinar on the multi-criteria analysis framework for assessing DSI policy options. The objective of this webinar today, and the main topic, you could say, is of course this DSI multi-criteria performance matrix. You've all received a link to a document that contains the matrix and gives some background. The link has been, or the document has been provided in English, French, and Spanish, so you will probably have looked at it. The point I want to make is that we are not so much going to focus on how to fill it in or what the results could look like, but rather on the tool as such, on the methodology, on how it can be used, what are difficulties, what is easy, where's the potential, where are possible limitations, etc. We will say more about this later on, but just as a framing already, this is our focus for today. So as soon as I've presented the agenda, we will have some opening remarks by Mr. Simon Malete from the Ministry of Environment in South Africa and from Gaute Vogt Hansen from the Ministry of Climate and Environment in Norway. And then there'll be a brief introduction, basically a reminder, because you've probably read the document, but a reminder and a bit of process background to, on the DSI multi-criteria performance matrix given by Hartmut Meyer. And then most of the webinar is devoted to our panel discussion. We have 4 very interesting, distinguished experts here, which will be introduced later on. I'm not going to speak about them now, just to say it's Dr. Amber Hartmann-Scholz, Georgina Catagoras-Vargas, Henri de Novion, and Dr. Sunil Archak. So we have also different continents on this panel. The overall panel facilitator will be Tim Hodges, whom I will introduce later on. But most of you will probably also know him. And that basically is all the time we have. Then there'll be brief closing remarks, basically from the initiative, what they take from this discussion. And at the very end, there'll be a brief evaluation of the webinar, which we encourage you to participate in. All right, with this, I would like to hand over to, I hope I got the right order, we didn't discuss this, but Mr. Simon Malete from the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment in South Africa. And after that, Mr. Gaute Vogt Hansen from the Ministry of Climate and Environment in Norway. For the time being, I will stop sharing my screen and I will ask Simon, please, to turn on your camera and your microphone and provide your welcome remarks.
Thank you very much. You would want me to also put on the camera?
That would be nice.
Okay, let me try and do that.
It's nice if people can see. Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much for that. Let me start by saying that my welcoming remarks are not going to be that long, given the time frame that we have for this discussion. In terms of the panel discussion, we would want to make sure that most of the information, most of the time, is actually spent on the panel discussions. Distinguished participants from all United Nations regions, invited panelists, all stakeholder groups, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Government of South Africa to this important webinar on the use and impact of the multi-criteria analysis that uses performance matrix to evaluate various policy options against a set of criteria and sub-criteria. in the context of the ongoing negotiations on DSI under the Convention on Biological Diversity. We recognize that the DSI negotiations are at an advanced stage, but the associated multi-criteria analysis is not yet widely understood. Hence, we organized this webinar to unpack the performance matrix methodology and its implications. I hope the outcomes of this webinar will contribute to your preparation for the upcoming negotiations on DSI. With these remarks, I wish you all a fruitful discussion. Thank you for your kind attention, and I now hand over to my counterpart from the Norwegian, Mr. Gaute. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you, Simon. So they're all welcome to the seminar organized under the South Africa-Norway bilateral partnership and facilitated by the ABS Capacity Development Initiative. As Simon says as well, my remarks will also be brief. The global dialogue on DSI under the South Africa-Norway bilateral partnership was established to foster informal exchanges, but also to increase the knowledge base on DSI. This reflects the fact that DSI is still regarded as a complicated and complex issue. Therefore, it's extremely important that we are guided by science and knowledge when we make our political choices as well. So we are now heading to Nairobi for the 4th session of the Open-Ended Working Group, where DSI is one of the topics to be discussed. Therefore, this is a very timely webinar indeed, where we'll get more familiar with the multi-criteria assessment framework, which will guide parties and stakeholders on how to address DSI in the context of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gaute. So with this, we are ready to start. And let me just see. So with this, we're ready to begin the content and to dive into our webinar. Thank you very much, Simon and Gaute, for your welcome remarks. As I said earlier, we first have a presentation, a brief background, basically reminder of where this metrics came from, what it is about, and where it's currently going. I see that some other new participants have joined in. So just a brief remark, you may have noticed the chat is disabled today because we have lots to discuss on the panel and will not be able to take any questions or discussion from the audience. And we would also like to focus really everybody on the panel discussion. We will post a brief note in case there are any technical issues, which we may or may not help to resolve. There will be, and Yannick is already posting it. There will be an email address that you can turn to. Okay, just 1 second. All right, so with this, I invite Dr. Hartmut Meyer, team leader of the ABS initiative. Yes, you've turned your camera on, to turn your mic on, and I will share my screen again so you can provide us with this background. Just 1 moment.
Exactly.
Sharing again. Here we go.
Okay.
Hartmut, please. Thank you.
So can you go to the next slide? I'm not okay. Well, that's great. Yes. Thanks, Katrin, for giving me the word. And I would also like to say good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all our participants. I can see we are now 150 persons watching this webinar on the multi-criteria assessment and the performance metrics. That's very encouraging, and I will give you a quick overview about what this is, where we come from, and then right away give the word to Tim to open the panel. Okay, so next slide, please. Well, this table that you can see here is actually this performance matrix. It was presented in a document to the last meeting of the open-ended working group in Geneva, and it is a tool, as you can see, to evaluate the 7 policy options on benefit sharing for the use of DSI, which are meanwhile on the table and also described in these documents. You see the options on top, ranging from option 0 to 6, and there are also some sub-options. A detailed explanation of what is behind these options you also find in these papers. And then there is meanwhile a set of 19 criteria sorted into like 4 groups against which we could assess these different options in a scoring format also, but also we could fill in like not applicable, or I don't know, or it doesn't fit at all. As I said, a further information on this multi-criteria analysis, which is a methodology introduced in our DSI discussions, including criteria, scoring, limitations, etc. You can find in this document for the Working Group 2023, as it is indicated here.
Excuse me, Hartmut, it seems that the French translation is currently not working. Can you
speak in French?
No, but I will speak, and I hope to get a reply. Can the Francophone, the French translation, maybe translate or say something? So
yeah, so I wait a bit. Yeah.
Yes, please wait a moment. So we have
no
that,
problem.
because that would be a pity.
So I hope we have sorted out this technical problem. Thanks a lot, Catherine and Yannick. So what I just want to say as a final remark for this panel is that currently the Secretariat has commissioned an independent review and the application of the framework to a consultant, and we are awaiting the results of this study on this methodology. So we can go to the next slide. You may wonder where this suggested methodology to assess these policy options came from. And it actually is, since quite a time, is developed since quite a time. So the first time at our policy options for DSI benefit sharing, and also what we call points of consideration for assessing these policy options, were developed at the first global dialogue on DSI, which the ABS initiative conducted in late 2019 in Pretoria. Then during 2021, in 2 webinars, the Secretariat of the Convention presented a whole set of policy options. At that time in February, there were 6 policy options derived from about 13 international reports and publications. A 7th option was added after the open-ended working group later. And also in another webinar, the Secretariat presented a concept for a multi-criteria analysis, which foresaw, let's say, there's a matrix where the policy options could be assessed against various criteria which the stakeholders, authors and scientists in these reports and publications were pointing as to be very important to assess DSI policy options. Then the next step, which I took up here, is the report of the informal co-chairs advisory group, which was published in November 2021. Also, this group advising the co-chairs for the DSI discussion, elaborated further on the methodology. You can find some good description in that report, and also in that report some limitations of the methodology were underlined. It is actually applicable to these policy options, but not to hybrid approaches, not to mixes between the policy options, of course, which some parties are suggesting. And also it was pointed out that if there are not enough data and evidence available for certain policy options, which of course can be the case because these options are still under negotiation and development, a full assessment might not be possible. Can you then bring to the next slide, please? Well, and where we are now, what are the recent steps in developing this international regime that I'm going to present shortly about the outcomes of the open-ended working group 3.2 in Geneva in March, where it once again became clear that parties disagree on main issues, for example, if DSI is in the scope of the CBD or not. But despite all differences, we have to say that the open-ended working group agreed on a final document which described the problems more closely. And they also recognized that a solution for fair and equitable benefiting on DSI should inter alia take into consideration these what are they, nine different points, and also those points, for example, a solution has to be efficient, feasible, and practical. Also those points are element of the matrix. So it seems that in a way also the negotiators already took into account some of these points of the matrix to actually ask parties that these criteria should actually be recognized in any future discussion. And if you go to the last slide, there were a lot of discussion on this new approach being taken in some international negotiations. And yeah, I show you the silver bullet car. So some thought that this could be the silver bullet, and as this car, which I depict, never really worked, also here we don't have a silver bullet. And let me just conclude with my personal remarks that I don't think that the performance matrix is a tool that will replace negotiation and solves all problems. I think that is not the nature of this matrix. And also any results which come out from filling it in, they will not be negotiated in the end. And also the matrix is not prescribed to be used by parties and stakeholders. So if you read the resolution of Geneva, there's no language on that. And also given the current lack of data and evidence, it also will not automatically generate any most favorable policy options. What it is rather, and I think that is something which we also would like to underline in this webinar, is it is actually an innovative approach for assessing options in international negotiations, as far as I can see that. It's there to stimulate the discussion amongst the parties and the various stakeholders. And also, I think it should be filled in by the very different stakeholders to support their further considerations, the further thinking about these policy options, and also finally, the further development of their positions in the DSI negotiations. I think with that, I would like to stop my short introduction, my short overview, and give back to you, Katrin, I think. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Hartmut, for this introduction and background reminder. So let me just go like this. Okay, so with this, we are ready to move to our panel. And I will basically introduce our panel facilitator, which is Timothy Hodges. Tim, if you could turn on your camera. You've already done that, so you're spotlighted now with me. I will turn mine off in a moment. So many of you will know Tim, but still for those few who don't, I will introduce you. Timothy Hodges is professor of practice in global governance at McGill's University's Institute for the Study of International Development. He's currently also the principal of an international consultancy that provides strategic advice. And many of you who know him from his former role as a career diplomat, as he has 3.5 decades, that's 35 years of experiences in multilateral, regional, and bilateral affairs. Also, probably several will know him from the negotiations towards the Nagoya Protocol, as he was then the co-chair of these negotiations that led actually to the adoption of the Nagoya Protocol. So with this, Tim, we're very curious to hear a little bit from you, and then also have our distinguished panelists introduced for, I think, a very interesting discussion. Tim, please.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Catherine, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As mentioned earlier, the centerpiece of this webinar is the panel session, and I would like to quickly move to introduce the panelists and focus on their remarks and benefit from the exercise of filling in the matrix that each of them undertook over the last week. But let me just say a few words about the nature of this webinar, its purpose, what it is and what it is not, and how we went about preparing with the panelists for this discussion. So at least in my mind, and it's evolved over preparations, but in my mind, the principal purpose of the webinar is actually, well, it's in fact threefold. Firstly, we hope to help demystify the matrix. Second, to encourage people to go through the exercise on their own, and also with others if they haven't yet. And finally, we're looking to improve understanding of the potential and the limitations of the matrix. And very much this webinar, the panel discussion itself is really about methodology, understanding methodology, and understanding its promise and its pitfalls. So again, we are moving to the panel, but we will also, as Catherine mentioned, we are going to launch 3 polls over the course of the panel session for everyone who is watching to fill out, and we will share the results of those live, share the results of those polls as the results come in. And I think the questions in the polls are quite interesting. I think you'll find it an interesting exercise to respond. And I know that virtually everyone on this webinar has been involved in DSI, either in the middle of the DSI discussion, or at least at the very least on the margins of it. So I know you will have views, and I know you will have experience. So we look forward to hearing from you via the polls. A little bit of how we went, how we prepared for the panel. Well, in fact, we met virtually with the panelists and asked each of the panelists to fill out the matrix independent of one another. So they went through the exercise of filling in the cells on their own. Subsequently, we asked them to share, in a confidential matter, but to share the results of filling in the matrix, the results and any possible notes that they may have made as going through the exercise with one another. So in advance of this panel discussion, the panelists have actually shared their notes and some of the results of the exercise that they undertook independent of one another. So this should be quite interesting. I've benefited from briefly looking at the results of each of the panelists' exercise, and I think this is quite fascinating in terms of overlap and divergence, and convergence. So they will, of course, describe what those are shortly. So again, the focus is on methodology. And the focus, of course, is on the results of the exercise. But this is not intended to be a critique of the methodology per se. It's just understanding how the exercise works, or perhaps doesn't work in some cases. And we just want to better understand the matrix as, which I see as actually being a learning tool. Maybe it can be more than that, but it can deliver in terms of learning. I've certainly learned quite a bit by trying to fill out the matrix myself. I think what it will do is show us, teach us, if it is a learning tool, teach us about our assumptions and the perspectives that each of us bring to the exercise. And that really is where we want to go, and look at the reasons why we fill things in the way we fill things in. And that really is the basis for, in my experience, ultimately in terms of negotiation, that is the experience that my experience suggests that that's the way to go forward in terms of ultimately reaching a shared conclusion about where we might go in terms of policy over the longer term. At the moment, however, given my discussions with government officials and Indigenous peoples representatives and of course stakeholders in a number of regions, there's obviously a wide range of views, opinions about DSI, of course there are, but there's also a wide range of views on the matrix itself and the exercise. Something it will render as, well, as Hutton would put it so well, it will be the silver bullet. It'll render a particular result, and that result will be taken up. There's the answer. Here's the solution. Here we go. As well, of course, we have a consultant commissioned by the SCBD, by the Secretariat, to work on the matrix and report back, and that should be very interesting. But again, I don't think it will be the silver bullet, but I think there are some people who think it will provide an answer or a series of answers. Still others, though, are actually, I think, to be frank, are fearful of the matrix. They're actually afraid of the exercise for a range of reasons, of course. They either distrust the methodology or they're afraid of the result. Still others are quite, I think, just ambivalent about the matrix. And then finally, I think there's a range of, a number of people who actually haven't even attempted to fill it in. So they've avoided it or just ignored it. So we have a range of views about the matrix and the exercise. In terms of the flow today for the panel, we've created 4 question rounds. And so we have 4 questions for the panel to address. And of course, the panelists are prepared. They have seen the questions, so they're ready to go. And again, we will launch short polls over the course of the panelist discussion. And I really do encourage everyone to respond to the polls. So as on time, let's start with an introduction of the panelists. And I think we are going to have the cameras on shortly for all the panelists, please. Thank you. And I think we've got everyone. Yes, Georgina Amber. Excellent. Thank you very much. Again, welcome to the panel and some brief introductions. Let's start with, well, alphabetically with Amber. Dr. Amber Hartmann-Schultz is a microbiologist and head of the science policy team at the Leibniz Institute, DSMZ, in Braunschweig, Germany. She leads several research projects, and I think people are quite well aware of her on access and benefit sharing. She pioneered the DSMZ's registered collection status under the EU Nagoya Protocol regs, and she co-founded the DSI Scientific Network. She's held several science policy posts in the US federal and California state governments. Next, with equal pleasure, I'd like to introduce our second panelist, Georgina Catacora Vargas. Georgina is a professor and researcher at Bolivian Catholic University. She's also a policy advisor, and again, well-known, and a consultant specializing in biodiversity, biosafety, agroecology, and sustainable food systems. She's worked for the Bolivian National Environment Competent Authority for 11 years. developing national policy on these issues and serving as Bolivia's delegate in various multilateral environmental agreements. So many of you will have met her. Next, a genuine pleasure to introduce our third panelist, Henri de Novion. Henri is a former director of genetic heritage of the Brazilian Ministry of the Environment. He's been following ABS international processes for 19 years. So in other words, since 2003, including a range of fora such as the CBD, the FAO, the ITPGRFA, and BBNJ. He is currently on sabbatical leave from the Ministry of Environment, acting as an international advisor for ABS compliant value chains and national implementation, and many will have met and certainly know of Henri's work. Finally, last but not least, I'd like to welcome Sunil Larchak. Sunil holds a PhD in plant biotechnology. He's been working at the Indian Gene Bank, ICAR NBPGR, for the past 25 years. Currently, he occupies the ICAR National Fellow Chair in Plant Genetic Resources Informatics. He teaches and guides PhD students at the Indian Agricultural Research Institute in Delhi, New Delhi. He has participated in the ITPGRFA negotiations since 2015. He's particular interest in PGR genomics, including DSI as a provider, a user, as well as the implementing agency. And again, many will have met and know Sunil. So welcome, everyone. It's terrific to have you here, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So we're going to turn now right away to the first question and a round of responses, followed by 3 more rounds of questions, as I mentioned, and answers posed by me. As noted earlier, we will run a total of 3 short polls interspaced between the panelist rounds. We hope they're helpful, the polls that is, but we also hope that they're not too distracting from the panelists. So I would like to ensure that we've got everybody's cameras on, super wide awake. You're from a range of regions, including my hemisphere as well. So it's early morning some places and later in the afternoon on others. Right. So the first question is a warm-up question, and it is as follows. Could you please share with us general experiences in filling out the matrix? For example, what was easy? What was difficult? Where did it help? Where did it not help? And what was the most sort of noteworthy result or reaction in your view to the exercise in general? You've got, as you know, 3 minutes to respond each. It's not much time, I know, and I apologize for that, but we've got lots to cover here. So we'll start with Sunil, followed by, in turn, by Amber, Ari, and Georgina. Sunil, please, if you would.
Thank you. Namaste from India. As mentioned earlier, the matrix appears complex for any first-timers. Considering the diversity of bioresources and the bio-based activities and the industries that we have, the scoring matrix is pretty reasonable, in fact. All we need to do is to spend some time on that. Keep a product in mind, keep an industry in mind, and then you start doing it all over again. So it becomes much more clear. And then these criteria become much more easier to understand. Now, for me, the options that are given in this particular matrix that are columns, the options are columns, they fall into 2 categories. One, the active options, the other is passive options. For example, if you want to keep something status quo, or if there are no benefit sharings from the DSI, these are very clearly passive options. That means we hardly have to do anything. The system as a whole hardly needs to do anything in that. Whereas other ones are very clearly active options where you have to decide whether you want to build a PIC or a MAT. That means with different types of contracts, or you want to build a paywall, and then you want to build an agreement with the third-party providers, etc. So these are very active options. So this is the first field that you have to first understand. Yeah, there are different options in this. Now, as far as the criteria are concerned, there are about so many criteria. I think there are 19 criteria divided into different categories there again. And for me, and perhaps for some others also, I have seen other panelists' responses. There are three which are most important criteria for me. The one which everybody is talking about is the criteria number 3. That means access to public databases will remain open or not. We may have different options and different criteria, but everybody is interested to know in whether you are having this particular pure or a hybrid option, or a country or a region or global as a whole, whether an option is going to keep this databases open for research and development or not. So that was an important one for me. The second one, which was very important for me, was the eighth criteria, that is legally clear and certain to implement. So this legal clarity and certainty for implementation is very important for both provider as well as the person who will access. And the third one, which is very important again, is whether the option is future ready or not. You are trying to select some option today. We discuss this for, let's say, a few more months or years, and then by the time we finish that, they should not become obsolete. So whether your option is future ready or not. So this is how I started. So I would like to share experiences in further questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Janil. Next.
I think it's me, Tim, right? I mean, just jump right in. I mean, the first thing that when Hartmut was so kind to extend the invitation to this panel, the first thing that I thought was, oh God, no. To be perfectly honest. And the reason is simply, you know, it's a bit overwhelming, right? And I'm kind of a DSI wonk, I guess, at this point, you know, 2-3 years later, being engaged in this topic, and yet even, you know, kind of living and breathing this stuff for a lot of the last 2 or 3 years, it's kind of overwhelming. So I can totally appreciate if this is something you do, you know, for a minority of your job, or a very small proportion, how you would be intimidated by this, because it is complex. And then when you try to add in the rankings, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, how do you choose between a 4 and a 5, or a 5 and a 6? It takes a lot of, yeah, we call it in German, Hirnschmalz, like brain fat or brain juice. I will say the one thing I would really encourage people to do, in spite of that initial, you know, barrier to entry of being like, no, I don't want to look at it. Get beyond that, sit down, take the hour or two of sitting there. But actually probably more important than sitting there by yourself doing it is to do it yourself and then compare your notes with colleagues. So we've had the opportunity to do this both in discussions around an open access workshop that we did right towards the end of last year on just the sort of open access database aspects. And then in the context of the DSI Scientific Network, we have a small working group that's also been tugging around with these ideas. And I can give you one little anecdote just to kind of wrap up. It's option 3.1 versus option 2.2. When you think about a global MAT versus, you know, payment to access, I think that these kinds of things can very easily turn into, well, what exactly did you think when you wrote your 4 or your 8 or your whatever ranking? We had the experience that our interpretations of what might be what were actually completely different, even between colleagues that are sitting relatively close together in terms of experience with DSI and the policy and the technical experience of giving actually vastly different answers. And so even though you might think, well, okay, across the political spectrum, we might, you know, appreciate that there's going to be differences. I can tell you from experience, even amongst colleagues that come from very similar backgrounds, we found very different numbers. And what that actually tells me at the end of the day, just to wrap up, is you really will never know what these options mean until we have more developed options. So this has to be a first step, and it will never be perfect in terms of its outcome.
Thanks very much, Amber. Henri?
Thank you, Tim. Hello, everyone. And thank you to the organizers for the invitation and for having me here today. An impression is that it was quite problematic to fill the matrix unbiased by our personal background, expectations, and preferences, as it was difficult to evaluate options that can contain diverse and opposite situations coexisting without being also influenced by one's life experience and social context. For instance, someone may rate highly options 5 ability to maintain public data open and to facilitate research and innovation. But if this is the adopted option at the international level for DSI use, parties may wish to restrict access to genetic resources originating in their country in order to capture in advance potential benefits from DSI use, what would require downgrading the capacity of option 5 to foster research and development. The same occurs with option 3.1 that may seem to keep open access to data with some sort of benefit sharing, but when we consider the economic context, the research and innovation have to face in developing countries, besides unstable internet, electricity, and funding, we may have to conclude that access to a sequence through payment can be a real impediment for many researchers in many countries. Thus, paying to use a sequence does not facilitate research and development and does not keep access to published data open to all. To conclude, some models were able to meet certain criteria well because they were designed to do so, which is not to say they address all the questions posed by different criteria, which also need to be tackled. In this sense, perhaps the option or combination of options, which eventually partially meets all expectations by attending most of the criteria goals, will likely be more effective than the option that fully meet few or one kind of expectation. I mean, the performance matrix exercise requires sensibility and otherness to balance opposite expectations. So direct access to open data and direct access to benefit sharing by indigenous people and local communities are equally regarded while evaluating the most effective policy option to be adopted. Thank you.
Thank you, Henri. Georgina, please.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you from my side too for the invitation. In relation to my experience with the matrix, well, it has been both interesting and challenging. Interesting because it is encouraging to reflect on various criteria and their application from different various perspectives, in this case from various DSI policy options. And now in relation to the challenges, and it was challenging because of certain assumptions that are behind that influence the criteria selection and their formulation. And I would like to elaborate briefly on that in 4 points. First, to me, one of the most challenging elements to answer, it was the formulation of the negative statements. For instance, the matrix includes does not hinder research and innovation. Based on this, there is the assumption that DSI regulation will jeopardize research, and perhaps it's not necessarily the case. A second challenge to me, it was the comprehensiveness of the sub-criteria under each parameter that is to be analyzed. For instance, good governance, which is a criteria, and it includes different sub-criteria. And in my view, good governance goes beyond actors understanding and enforcing the different aspects that a policy option may entail, which is the framework of good governance in the matrix now. But good governance also includes participation, transparency, accountability, and those aspects are not considered in this sub-criteria in the matrix. And another example could be, for instance, coherent and adaptable as a criteria, which is restricted to international regulation and technological and scientific development, which are very important by themselves. But coherence also relates to, for instance, consistency with national policies and local context. Third challenging point to me was the aspects of fairness and equity, which are not really addressed as sub-criteria when relating to benefit sharing. And the fourth is that all the criteria and sub-criteria are put at the same level. And perhaps not all of them are equally important, and some of them might be more important to fulfill the third objective of the CBD, as well as the objectives of the Nagoya Protocol. So that was my experience, and some of my reflections when filling out the matrix. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgina. Thanks to all the panelists. You know, the most challenging, the word challenging has come up, I think, raised by all of you. That was my experience as well. Of course, I'm not here to talk about my experience, but the most challenging part of this panel discussion clearly is going to be, for me, is actually not reacting. I mean, I'm sure you will get some reactions from those who are following along today. One thing I have to admit, though, I will volunteer this, and I shouldn't, that I was a little bit skeptical of this, of the matrix exercise when I first learned about it, because I hadn't seen it before. And it is quite brave and quite innovative in an international negotiation context, in a CBD context. I mean, you take an engineering tool and apply it to DSI. So I was a little bit surprised and a little bit skeptical, but I have to say, I have to admit, just now listening to you, I'm less skeptical of it. And I actually think it's going to be quite useful, and understanding the reasons why people do what they do when they react to the matrix. So thank you for that. And I will not volunteer another opinion on this panel session, and I also wanted to thank you again for being so candid. And I think it's actually very brave of you to be on the panel. So Katrin, we're going to go to our first poll, and then we'll go to our second round of questions. Katrin, please.
Please leave your cameras on. The poll is on top of all. So our first question, I will read it because we only have it in English and it will be translated, is: have you actually tried to fill out the matrix? You in the audience, everybody. And there's 6 possibilities, but you can only choose one. Yes, I did it by myself. Or yes, I did it with colleagues, i.e. people I worked with directly. Or yes, I did it together with multiple stakeholders. So widening rounds of people that could be possible. Or no, and we'd like to know why, if it's no. Either no, because you haven't been aware of it, or no, because you didn't find the time yet, or actually because perhaps no, so far you didn't see the usefulness of it. So these are the 6 options. Let's give it a few more seconds to see. I think a little more than half of participants have made their choice. We encourage as many as possible to give your answer. Let's take maybe 10 more seconds.
I hope we do better than 50%. This is the easiest question.
Yeah, that's the easiest question. But we're now at actually 2/3 of participants, so it is useful to give a bit more time. But not okay, 70%. I would say let's go, because we also want to reflect a little bit on it. So please, Yannick, my colleague, technical admin, please share the results. And Tim, you may want to say a word or two about these results. Do you see it, Tim?
Yes, I do. Yes, I'm just reading it, reflecting on it.
It is allowed to think in this webinar.
Well, I have to say I'm not surprised.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you everyone for responding. And one good thing, it's anonymous, so you can easily be quite forward and honest. Yeah, I thought there would be almost predictably not that many people, fairly low proportion in my view, who've actually really tried to tackle this. And again, that's not a criticism at all. I think that's just the fact. And the entry, I think Amber used the term, the entry is difficult. It's quite daunting. And then what I think one of the points of this panel discussion is to actually make it a little less daunting, encouraging people. Of course, what I'm interested in is, other than those sort of entry-level problems, why people why it's so low. Are there other underlying reasons? But perhaps we can find that out through another poll, or we will never know. So this is really quite revealing. Thank you again.
Yes, I think it's also, if I may say, I think it's also interesting that there's rather few people who did it with multiple stakeholders, and quite a lot of people who actually didn't find the time yet. So it seems to be something that gives the impression that you need to really take time for it. But let's
and
continue.
It could be, sorry, it could be as well, not to prolong this, but the people are waiting, legitimately, of course, waiting for, maybe it's the consultant's report, maybe just it's difficult to convene people, are waiting to further discuss it informally when they get to Nairobi. But I'm sure there are many reasons.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So let's move on with the panel discussion.
Right.
Actually,
so this
wait, just 1 second. I see something on the screen. So is it, have the results been shared? Yes, I think so. I hope so. Okay. Unfortunately, we now have. Okay, anyway, so please go ahead.
Right, thanks, Catherine. So second round of, well, second question and round of responses. And this is getting, we're getting a little bit deeper here. So for the panelists, when you compared your respective results, and I know it's been difficult to share them in a timely fashion, but you've all shared them. And I hope you've at least had a glance at your fellow panelists' worksheets. The question is, where did you find the strongest convergences and divergences? And if you could provide, I think contextually would be helpful to everyone following along today, if you could provide 1 or 2 examples just to illustrate the convergence, divergence areas, that would be helpful. And again, we're trying to understand the reasons why there are clear convergences and divergences, rather than to talk about the convergences and the divergences only. Right. So I think on this round, yes, we are. We're going to start with Amber, and then we'll move to Henri, Georgina, and then Sunil. Thank you. Amber?
Wait, I had B first, Tim, but if you want me to go first. Yeah, all right. You caught me off guard, that I will jump into it. Yeah, I think I just following up and agreeing with what you said earlier, I think that the real art of taking the time to do this is the mental exercise of trying to objectively quantify things. And so I really appreciated seeing, even if I didn't agree, just sort of seeing people's sort of objective idea, or subjective analysis sort of laid bare in an objective way, if that makes any kind of sense. Mm-hmm. So I found it really helpful, and I really appreciate the colleagues, and I complete mea culpa. I was, of the 4 of us, the very last one to put my matrix forward. So sorry about that, guys. I guess there's 3 observations that I really had about potential convergences and divergences among us. What was really interesting to me is an option that I think is actually quite compelling, which is option 3.2, which is sort of multilateral and then other. It's not necessarily the paying for access to data, but I think, for example, of Dr. Paul Oldham's sort of cloud-based fees model is put under option 3.2, or also sort of the certification or green seal sort of ideas is also under option 3.2. I find that a really interesting unexplored area for DSI that hasn't been discussed yet. And yet there were fellow panelists here that basically said, I have no idea what this column even means. And so that was sort of interesting for me, you know, oh bummer, one of my favorite columns actually wasn't even able to be evaluated by one of my panelists because it wasn't really clear what the option meant. So that tells me, okay, there's still a lot of need for discussion. I would say, I probably had the most confusion when looking at other panelists' answers on jurisdiction shopping, where options that I would say, yeah, definitely jurisdiction shopping can answer here. And they were like, no problem at all. And I was like, how did we end up here? And I think probably what that means is thinking about jurisdiction shopping from a national point of view, and maybe less so from like a scientific point of view. For me, it's clear that if we go down a bilateral route, that countries, for example, like the United States, Germany, much of Northern Europe, those countries won't regulate DSI, and therefore I have the opportunity to jurisdiction shop and use only German DSI, and therefore bilateral mechanisms make that easy. But I guess if you're thinking about it, well, I regulate all my country's DSI, then the user can't jurisdiction shop because I regulated all of my national DSI. So I'm thinking that could be the source of the confusion, but that's just a hypothesis. And I guess the other point of confusion too that I noticed was maybe what does global MAT mean? Is that actually like a change to the database terms and conditions, or does global MAT mean a license, or does it mean something else entirely? I think that there's just a lot of wiggle room that then leads to different kind of interpretation downstream. Those are my three sort of techie observations, Tim.
Thank you, Amber. Interesting. Henri?
Thank you, Tim. A convergent evaluation for me relates to option 4, which we all agree should be a permanent cross-cutting objective rather than an option. I try to evaluate the matrix not with the eyes of a regulator, as it would be expected, but I challenge myself to evaluate the matrix with the eyes of someone concerned with biodiversity conservation, who wants sustainable use to continue to happen in a balanced regulatory environment, an environment which converges expectations of regulators and regulated with our common goals. And reflecting on other panelists' matrices, and also those from other colleagues from Brazil and abroad, I realized the obvious, that there is convergence of intents. On the other hand, there is expectation of achieving them through different paths. Moreover, in some of those evaluations, the score applied sheds light on the stakeholder who answered the matrix. If each of the DSI stakeholders fill out this matrix based only on their expectations and assumptions, with the bias of the sector they belong to, it will be challenging to make a comprehensive assessment that allow us to identify dispassionately what will be efficient in delivering our common goals, which are conserved biodiversity, available for sustainable use generating value and benefits fostering conservation. To sum up, it would be very interesting to get rid of the sectorial look and seek to fill out this matrix in order to answer one fundamental question, which is not how to evaluate criteria in order to favor the option that best suits mine and my groups of interests, but how to evaluate the criteria and policy options under the perspective of common interest, so that our look seeks to balance individual and sectoral expectations, replacing it by one guided by empathy to divergent expectations. I mean, it would be interesting to evaluate the criteria and policies from the perspective of what matters most for biodiversity conservation. The focus should be the interests of nature, therefore of us all. In short, I would invite and suggest we seek the judgment that brings us closer to the 3 objectives of the convention and conducted under the cross-cutting gaze of otherness. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, very, very interesting remarks. Georgina, please.
Thank you. I will focus more on methodological aspects of divergence and convergence. And I will start with divergence. To me, it was very interesting to see the different types of scoring. 2 of us used qualitative scoring and the other 2 quantitative, although the matrix is designed for quantitative analysis. But in my view, this shows that there are different approaches to the matrix based on different factors that could be availability of information, level of uncertainty surrounding the different parameters or others. And now, in relation to the convergences, some parameters were ranged with values, with a certain range of value, quantitative value, or indicated partially. And for instance, it's not a trend, but just an example. This is how was valued the potential to deliver predictable non-monetary benefits. And perhaps this value was given because this particular criteria will depend on how the system and the DSI policy option will be set, and which are the actors, how are the actors are going to actually operate. And on top of everything, to me, this shows that there is no, or perhaps there is no a clear-cut scoring for each of the different criteria and sub-criteria. Also, another aspect what to me was interesting is that different criteria were qualified as uncertain, as unclear, or with question marks. And once again, this was not a common trend, but some criteria that included this type of valuation were implementable in an efficient and timely manner, facilitates the sharing of benefits with IPLCs, access to public databases remain open, and just as examples. And to me, this indicates that perhaps we don't have all the information needed to score some of these criteria in a clear way, and we feel more comfortable, some of us felt more comfortable giving question marks. And these two aspects of convergence, in my opinion, highlight the importance of filling out the matrices, using also other tools that are complementary, but also through a multi-actor and transdisciplinary approach, following up what Henry has been stressing by now, which is to include or not to consider the otherness. And also another aspect that I can mention is that the use of not applicable in different criteria and sub-criteria used highlight the need to complement the different elements of the different policy options, because one policy option perhaps does not have all the elements that we are considering that are good for implementing comprehensively DSI policy option. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgina. Again, fascinating. Sunil.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Before I actually started working on the convergences or divergences across the panelists, first I sought to understand whether there is any particular pattern that when I have filled it across the columns or at the end of rows, that is there any, let's say, particular pattern that I am doing something, let's say, because I have thought something about one particular, let's say, criteria, and the same thing is being reflected in all other criteria, irrespective of the knowing or not knowing full details, technical details of that one. So I did some of that kind of an exercise, and I saw that indeed there is a correlation between how I start thinking on the first one, which is going to affect what I'm going to fill in the other one. So we should be a little careful, and that is possible only when I focus on specific, let's say, product or a specific industry or specific kind of exchange model. Otherwise, it becomes a little difficult at this point of time. Okay, as far as convergences are concerned, before me, a couple of speakers mentioned that the convergences across the options. I am trying to present here convergences across the criteria. So what are those criteria where we are all looking at, we are unknowingly reaching a convergence? And those, interestingly, are the ones which I mentioned earlier also in my earlier intervention about the open access. Three of us were convergent on this particular thing which I'm mentioning: open access, legal clarity and certainty, cost of the setup, as well as the future readiness. So these were the criteria upon which we were all, let's say, having more or less, because as Georgina mentioned, two of us gave quantitative scores, two of us gave qualitative scores, but still on a relative basis, we were converging on this particular thing. And I suppose the reason, because I was trying to think why this has happened, and perhaps the reason is consciously or not knowingly, we were thinking about what is the trigger point for benefit sharing. For example, in a particular option 2, that is only MAT option, where there is no trigger point for the access. Whereas in other, we have a clear trigger point as the access. Access is the trigger point. So the moment this particular thing is, let's say, governing your decision, these convergences are happening. So it is very important for all of us before we fill these matrix that to know exactly where we are, let's say, which is bias, making our thinking biased towards something, and then hold back that one and then try different things. But this is what I have found out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sunil. We are going to go shortly to the second poll, to Catherine. But let me just say something. A confession. I mean, in my experience as a reformed or a former international multilateral negotiator, when I reflect back on those experiences, much of it was related to as a tactically, strategically, as a negotiator, to emphasize differences. And I think, you've all of you, the four of you have confirmed in my mind that the matrix can do that, but it can also remind us where there is a possibility. I think Henri said it, convergence of intent and empathy. And so my confession is, I've had this fantasy for a little while. I don't think I've said it to anyone, but a fantasy where we would actually get into a convene a closed door discussion, or maybe open door, with not just negotiators, not just government officials, but stakeholders as well, of course, importantly, indigenous peoples, and role play, right? Actually challenge people to put on a different suit, wear a different dress, be an industry spokesperson or industrialist, or try and be an indigenous person from that perspective. So change roles. And I think that could be very useful. And if I were in charge, that's what I would do with the negotiators at some juncture. And they will be extremely unhappy to do that, I expect, but some of them might actually enjoy it. So that's my fantasy. That's my DSI fantasy. Fortunately, the chat's not open to everyone, so we won't be seeing other people's fantasies. Catherine, for the second poll, please.
Yes, thank you, Tim. And it's actually nothing Yannick. So here is the second poll question, which is by who and for what purpose should the matrix be used, in your opinion? And here you actually have multiple choice. You can choose more than one. And the first option is by neutral experts to make a robust assessment. The second is by negotiators to identify convergences and divergences. The third is by anyone as a thinking tool. And the fourth option is by multiple stakeholders as a basis to discuss collectively. So again, we'll give it a few moments, especially since you now have several choices. So 50% of people seem to have made up their minds. Let's try to get to 70% at least. We're at 60 now. I'll be very curious to see what the result is. And there's still replies coming in, so let's just wait for another moment. Now at 68%, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 people could still participate so that we get to those 70%. 16. All right, one more. Okay, we stick with the 69% of participation, and I ask Yannick to share the screen. Let's have a look at this. Interesting. And I leave it to Tim to say a few words about what he thinks about this, but of course he has to think first.
Well, I think I could say something quite positive, actually. I find it encouraging that the largest proportion of respondents have actually sort of underlined the need to discuss collectively. Now, of course, that's in the context. With multiple stakeholders. So I would interpret that as meaning the people feel that a diversity of people and a discussion with a diversity of people with the matrix would be helpful. And I think that's absolutely the case. But it doesn't mean, I mean, but there's still fairly high proportions of respondents indicating a different way to look at the matrix as a tool, and that's good too. So there is a fairly pretty broad range of responses here, none of them very small. So it's kind of I think that's, I mean, there's little to say other than it's clearly there's a multiple ways to use the matrix, and people have just simply indicated that. But again, I think the positive part is in particular the collective discussion response.
Yes, thank you very much, Tim.
Oh, perhaps Amber's reminded me, perhaps to clarify whether or not people were allowed to provide multiple responses. I wasn't sure if that was clear.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
This was a multiple choice question, and I think it says it also on the screen. I also mentioned it.
Yeah. Okay.
So, yeah, so probably individuals also thought that it can be used for several purposes, which is probably
Yes.
a good thing to say. All right, I hand back to Tim for the next panel question, and we stop sharing the poll. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And again, a rather interesting poll, and thanks to everyone for responding. Maybe we can get to 80% next time. So the question for this round to the panelists is as follows. In your view, what are the implications if a criterion scores very high or very low for any policy option? Again, what are the implications if a criterion score is very high or very low for any policy option or any given policy option? This may sound like a simple or maybe even a simplistic question to some, but I think it's actually quite a crucial question. And of course, obviously not just for the panelists, but globally for governments and indigenous peoples and stakeholders alike. And I think in this context, it would be helpful if you could cite a couple of examples drawn from the exercise of filling in the matrix, of course, and comparing notes with your fellow panelists. So we're going to start this round with Henri, followed by Georgina, Sunil, and then finally Amber. So Henri, you're first.
Thank you for your question, Tim. After some reflection, what grabbed my attention was that in my matrix, options 0 and 5 scored 0 in different criteria. The first failed to punctuate in all the sub-criteria of criteria D, coherent and adaptable, while the later scored 0 in criteria A, effective in achieving policy goals. So I would suggest that options that fail to punctuate in each of the 4 criteria, or even that fail to have a minimal rating in fundamental sub-criteria, such as potential to contribute to the conservation or facilitating research and innovation, should be eliminated. The best evaluated were the options that I believe dialogue more frankly with the reality of the facts, which is the idea of a single global standardized contract enforced through an international monitoring system, facilitating direct access to benefits by LPOCs to promote biodiversity conservation. Options with further details, as mentioned by Sunil, were highly rated, such as option 2.2 and option 6, which went further to indicate the point of incidence of benefit sharing, and also to suggest a potential global benefit sharing mechanism, thus providing a more concrete picture to be evaluated under the relevant criteria. To conclude, some options may be anachronic, the status quo, no benefit sharing, options based on a case-by-case regulation, or those that suggest regulating techniques rather than outcomes of DSI use. They all seem to be at the extreme ends of our options gradient, while options that favor agreement at international level and multilateral implementation sound to be better balanced. So, as taught by Siddhartha Gautama, that one day heard an old musician on a passing boat speaking to his pupil, if you tighten the string too much, it will snap, and if you leave it too loose, it won't play. We should also seek balance while fine-tuning the ABS instrument for DSI, because if we only stretch the string of open access, it will break confidence in the ABS instrument. But if we don't stretch the benefit sharing string tight enough, it won't play the ABS notes that in turn trust and that sing the music of biodiversity conservation. Thank you.
Very elegantly put. So a fine balance. Huh? Georgina.
Thank you. My response on this is not as poetic but comprehensive as Henry just did, but I will focus more on the matrix implications as a tool for analyzing different DSI policy options, rather than the matrix ability to provide answers about the specific policy options. And I am following this approach also in consistency with my previous comments on the matrix challenges and sub-criteria not reflected yet, of course, from my personal analysis. And some of those methodological implications are that the process of analyzing the various DSI policy options will be more comprehensive if it employs a different approaches or tools, not one. We are now dealing with one, but not one, but not many, but at least a few of them that collectively embrace various elements, various relevant elements of DSI in light of the objectives of the CBD and, of course, the objectives of the Nagoya Protocol. A second implication, in my view, is that the process of analyzing these different DSI policy options once again require a multi-actor from different sectors and a transdisciplinary exercise. And finally, this process that I am referring to, to be multi-actor, multi-sector, transdisciplinary, accordingly more inclusive, also will need to consider the national context and national priorities, also to be meaningful at national, local level, and from there to build up, scale up to larger scales of implementation of DSI policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgina. Sunil, I think you're next.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Yeah. It all depends upon initially, in fact, when I started filling up the matrix and started discussing with my colleagues, as Georgina mentioned, we were initially focusing a lot on the option not applicable or do not know, N/A, NA. We thought perhaps we would be filling more and more that kind of things because we might not know too much about it. But then I realized slowly that there is a subjective bias, and that subjective bias is not because we don't know something. The moment we start knowing more and then knowing in detail, the knowledge and the experience in a specific area is going to make us biased towards a specific option. I would like to explain that one. If I have got my experience and then expertise in, let us say, managing databases, and then working with interoperability, and then working with different, let's say, institutional database, and then country database, and the international databases, I know exactly all those, let's say, difficulties and then challenges that we have in terms of technicalities. On the other hand, let's say I am on the negotiating table as well as I'm working with communities. I know exactly that some of these things are not even looking at the requirements that, as Henry mentioned, some of these are not even looking at these requirements. And the third option, as an industry person, let's say I'm from industry, I would like to see that, okay, this is becoming a little difficult because the details of the intricacies of working with individual countries having different legislations or not having legislations, or perhaps are not reflecting on in one go. They are there in bits and pieces in different places. So these subjective biases of knowing in detail is causing these high scores in one or the low scores in the other, rather than not knowing things. This is what I got at the end of filling of this particular exercise. And one very important observation from my side is having high scores for option number 6, that is 1% levy on retail sales of the genomic resources or genetic resources, whatever. And that is a very interesting. That means all of us would like to see that the onus should be transferred to the fund managers and the chartered accountants, so that we let's focus more on our actual use of genomic resources and then work on things. Because the moment you give it is 1% option, that means fantastic, because you are focusing more on accessing, working, and then not much about at what stage of triggering and what is happening, where it is going, etc. So this is very interesting. This, if every time we let's say choose this option 6 of 1% levy, that means somehow we are transferring the responsibility elsewhere. Thank you.
Yes, it's called a 1% solution. Very interesting again. Thank you. Amber, I believe you're next. Well, you're the last.
Yeah, I'm lucky to go last here, because actually I agree. I mean, Henry's comments in particular really resonated with me, but I agree with the different perspectives. And so maybe I can just add some specific observations. I think the one horizontal criteria that I was the most surprised about was the non-monetary benefit sharing. I think there were a lot of us that had NA or question mark, I don't know. And even, I mean, again, I think about DSI a lot and databases and structures, and did a study for the CBD on databases. And I was like, ooh, I don't really know what any of these options do to non-monetary benefit sharing. So maybe a shout out to you policymakers out there. We need to talk about non-monetary benefit sharing in DSI, and in particular, you know, the argument that I and many other colleagues have made is that things like open access databases, which is a separate criteria, actually could, from many perspectives, look like a type or a form of non-monetary benefit sharing, for example. So if you wanted me to evaluate it through that lens, then maybe you actually use a different criteria to evaluate non-monetary benefit sharing. But no matter what, non-monetary benefit sharing in the context of DSI hasn't actually gotten assessed in these options, and I found it very difficult to assess. And I understand the value of, perhaps because the monetary one might be the trickier one to figure out why we started there, but we don't want to forget about that. The other trend that all four of us, I believe, had, I mean, to different quantitative proportions, or as Georgina pointed out, some of us use yes and no instead of numbers. But no matter what, the column treating treating DSI as a genetic resource, that one looks pretty weak for all of us. I mean, I think that we find some real differences from everything else, but I think that treating DSI as GR is very close to being able to being thrown out, and that the technical understanding amongst us as a community has grown, that we see that it clearly information can't be treated in the same way as a physical object. I think that is encouraging, that we're seeing that probably equally. Yeah, I'll stop there. Those are my main thoughts.
Thank you, everyone. Again, it's difficult not to hold back, and that's a good thing. In part of my work at McGill, I am looking at the connection or lack of connectivity between international policy and lawmaking and its implementation on the ground. So in communities, in state level, even at the national level. And based on my work and my experience, I think it's a very weak link often. And so when I hear from the panelists that we need to take into account where people are coming from and who might be doing what, and success ultimately in terms of implementation of whatever the policy might be on DSI going forward, by real people with real problems, and is extremely important. So that's again underscores the need for collective broad discussions of DSI, because it's not just complicated, and that not just there are many views, but rather that there are many potential solutions, not just pitfalls, that someone might have out there, including implementers, including communities, for example. So broad-based collective discussion, I think, is extremely important, particularly in this, I would argue. I think we're ready to go to the next round. And for this, we are not going to launch a poll, but rather we'll launch a poll after this fourth and well, indeed, next round, the fourth and final round, I think. So let's do that. So this second, this final question, well, it says follows. Maybe predictably, what conclusions do you draw from the exercise regarding your own preferred model, whether it be one of the pure options, one of the listed options in the matrix axis, or maybe a hybrid model combining different options, or maybe an entirely different model that you believe might be best suited for dealing with DSI? This sounds like a bit of a naive question, but I think it helps to sort of reveal some of working assumptions that everyone brings to this exercise, including, of course, the panelists. We're going to start with Georgina, and then we'll move to Sunil, Amber, and then finally Henri, and then ultimately to the next and final poll. So let's please, Georgina, if you would.
Thank you, Tim. I will start briefly on the specific point you are addressing. And I would like to say that while a pure policy option sounds interesting, perhaps it's not really feasible, because DSI by itself and its implementation has many nuances, and it might need to be complemented by elements from other options in such a way that help us to move towards DSI regulation that is flexible but feasible, but also fair and effective in relation to the achievement of the objectives of the CBD. But in addition to that, I would like to share a few also personal conclusions, which is, to me, the matrix is an interesting exercise that in this panel. It will benefit from the collective wisdom and from the different views in trying it and answering the questions that it involves. A second personal reflection is that not all the matrix criteria and sub-criteria actually have the same level of relevance. It didn't have among ourselves, these 42 people who tried the matrix, but it will not have the same level of relevance among different countries and different actors. So once again, because of that, these matrix would benefit from complementing with other tools and other approaches to have a more comprehensive analysis of DSI options, policy options. And accordingly to my previous questions, in my view, the matrix is, yes, it's interesting and it's a useful tool for reflection, rather for a decision-making process on which is the policy option will require, once again, more tools that complement the aspects analyzed, involve different actors, and of course, help us to move in a very robust way, hopefully, in achieving the three objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So thank you. And once again, it was a really nice, interesting experience to share this exercise with you all.
Thank you very much, Georgina. And I guess what you're ending on your intervention on a very positive, I think, constructive note. So that means we're not quite finished with the matrix or with DSI yet, right? All right, Sunil?
Yeah, thank you, Tim. in fact, first round of intervention, I wanted to mention this one, that the option 4 that says that enhanced technical and scientific support or capacity building. I would rather think that this should be subsumed into all other options. This must be a part of all other options, because enhancing the technical support or capacity building alone is never an option. It is part. So this is how it starts. For example, I would like to think now that we do not have a very successful experience in international treaty. I basically come from negotiating table of international treaty on plant genetic resources for food and agriculture. And then we have some difficulties there. Yeah. And the difficulties are, whereas it is much more uniform, homogeneous compared to the challenges that CBD faces, or the negotiators face here in CBD and Nagoya Protocol. There it is much more homogeneous and uniform, but still we have difficulties. Georgina already mentioned those. So in such cases, let's say one size fits all kind of approach would never be able to work. One can only provide a, let's say, guiding framework that, look, these are the 3 possible options depending upon the requirement, and then start working on that. Let's say this will, after that, mature into some kind of convergent model where everybody would like to then fall in place depending upon how much technical and then scientific development has taken place in various places, and then utilization of funds. Now, after saying that particular thing, I would like to say, for example, option 2, whether we have a country contracting kind of thing or a global contract, mutually agreed terms. Now, people should be able, the contracting party should be able to have both of them depending upon the nature of the bioresource. For example, if a particular bioresource is endemic to a country, then country would like to, let's say, work differently with that kind of a bioresource. Or if the bioresource is is present in multiple countries, then they would like to work with different. So there must be different options. The principle should be common. That means, would you like to trigger the benefit at this particular point or not? The process or the details must be, let's say, a little more optional. This is the first point. Now, the second point is, we should learn a little bit from what is happening in WTO. Perhaps many of you already know about that. That is fundamentally a multilateral agreement. But we all see how within that multilateral agreement framework, we have bilateral agreements, and then we have regional agreements between EU and others, and then we have multiple regional agreements. So there is always possibility of thinking out of the box within the provided framework, and then see how it works. Georgina mentioned, and we all keep mentioning this one, we want a business ready, we want a functional kind of thing, rather than something which is, let's say, philosophical or something, well, this is how it should work. No, it should be functional, it should be fair. If we balance these 2 things, I think we should be able to do that. And for that, we certainly will be looking, we must look for some kind of hybridity. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunil. Again, very terrific perceptions. You know, and what I've heard from you is sort of thinking of the box. That is interesting. I think we often have habits in certain forums to do the way we've always done things, continue to do that. And I mean, that's just that's a sort of human nature, but it is possible to think of the box. And you know, you're talking about flexibility, sort of iterative and sort of learning approaches to this, and incremental approaches. I think those are very interesting ideas as well, which also in part builds on some of Georgina's remarks. So who's next? Let's see, we got Amber.
I have to disagree a little bit with what was just said by Sunil, and I see eye to eye on a lot of things. But actually, my feeling on hybrid, at least right now, is based upon actually my very early comments, which is that the stuff's kind of hard. And actually each option is rather underdeveloped by necessity. So right now we have 6 options, and they're each rather undescribed, that we need to know a lot more information to be sure that our analysis was correct. And therefore, what you would do in a perfect world is you would actually develop each option more to be able to understand it. And then you would have a really, really hard matrix and a really, really hard job in front of you. And what I take away from that assessment is that if we go hybrid, like multiple different options at the same time, we actually exponentially increase the complexity. And I think that the discipline, as hard as it is, you know, when I go to the toy store with my kids, you know, they want all the toys. You can't have all the toys because A, we don't have endless amounts of money, and B, it's just the wrong way to raise a kid. And so I think the same thing comes true when we're talking about DSI options, which is we can't have all the toys in the toy store. We have to pick the toy that's going to bring us the most pleasure for the longest amount of time. And if we try to have multiple different things going at the same time, the intellectual complexity, not to mention the international negotiation that will be required to develop each of those fully, is pretty huge. So the discipline as a community to try to focus and narrow in is going to be needed, and it's going to be needed actually sooner rather than later. And trying to keep all of the toys in the toy box indefinitely will actually just have us spinning our wheels and probably even leading to potentially more conflict. So actually, your question, Tim, was what conclusions do you draw from this exercise regarding your own preferred model? Perhaps not surprising to me, option 6 is still incredibly sexy. There's the universal MAT, global MAT, I can't remember, global universal, same thing maybe, is still also quite interesting depending upon implementation. And then, as I mentioned earlier, options 3 other, not 3.1, but the 3.2-ish bucket. There's a lot of cool and clever ideas out there that I think are underdeveloped. So perhaps not surprising given my background, but I can easily say based on this metrics, and now I sort of have the numbers and the data to back it up, that my observations sort of out of intuition are now sort of validated by that. So by the numbers that we've had the opportunity to sort of collect during this exercise. So, I mean, thank you to the organizers for challenging, putting us up to the challenge in spite of our initial hesitations, perhaps, or at least my hesitations. And I also want to thank Georgina and Sunil and Henry for the braveness of sharing your analyses, because it's such a pleasure to have that feedback and that exchange.
Thank you very much, Amber. Ari, last but not least.
Thank you, Tim. My conclusion is that the option or combination of options to be adopted shall operate within a democratic and transparent system of governance. We should seek the option which can better include and engage stakeholders in its implementation so as to subject their different expectations to the same reality check. The notion of otherness is fundamental for the policy option to be effective in its objectives of expectations accommodation. And that is most likely to occur under an option of a multilateral nature. In this sense, a policy option suggesting a single internationally standardized MAT for DSI use and benefit sharing from commercial use could be simpler and more effective to achieve coherence and adaptation goals. This one-stop shop global MAT could accommodate DSI use negotiated under other multilateral fora and be tailored to cover sectorial and non-jurisdictional DSI use, such as DSI use from Antarctic organisms and from beyond national jurisdiction, but also to cover those cases where the country of origin of the DSI is known. I mean, benefits from the commercialization of goods from DSI use, despite the origin of the DSI, could all be governed by this single global MAT and channeled to a fund of multilateral nature. This multilateral governance approach is more likely to provide transparency, legal certainty, and confidence to invest in bio-based value chains. And by multilateral, I mean multi-stakeholder participation in the decision-making, including in the global benefit sharing mechanism. I mean, IPLCs, databases, companies, and consumers' representatives should all be integrated and play a more protagonistic role in the policy design and governance. So to conclude, I believe the current situation of biodiversity loss should be reason enough for all stakeholders, not only parties, to feel compelled to give up part of their high expectations on ABS and DSI, and with that, converge to seek simplicity on both ends of the ABS spectrum. Because ensuring direct access to open public data is as important as ensuring efficient access to funding to support IPOC's conservation efforts. And both need to be done through simplified procedures based on trust and otherness. And with that, I also like to thank the opportunity to share my views with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henri. Again, it's a big challenge not to highlight some of your very important perceptions and honest, I think, perceptions. And one thing that does, I recall that one thing that does concern me is, yeah, there's always danger, and that was common discussion in the Nagoya Protocol negotiations as well. In fact, I think in Cartagena biosafety negotiations, concern with jurisdiction shopping. Yes, that concerns me in terms of policy, global policy making. I think it's important to consider that possibility, but also I think every one of you have mentioned other forums, other fora. And so, you know, yeah, we've got CBD, but of course we have ITPGRFA, as you know, mentioned, some ways, WIPO to some degree, certainly BBNJ, etc., and WHO, that are not irrelevant. And I guess what I haven't yet seen is a discussion of how we might either work collaboratively or uniformly or singly. I think whether, I'm not saying that's my preference and my views don't really matter, but I think we should be talking about that, particularly in the context of DSI. Maybe that's an obvious point. So enough from me. We are now finally going to our third and last poll. Catherine, please.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm going to read this again, but I want to alert everybody also that this is not yet the evaluation of the webinar. That comes after the webinar, but it's a little bit about what you've heard. So the question is, having heard all this, in which way has your view on the matrix changed, if it has? And there's 6 options. You have only one choice. The first is, I find it more useful now. Second is, I find it less useful now. The third is, I find it clearer, more accessible. The fourth is, my view has not changed at all. The fifth is, I am more confused than before. And the sixth is, I don't know yet. I haven't made my mind up yet. So let's see what the impressions are.
I do wish we could, the panelists and I could
participate, yes. Also, I'm coming back.
A little left out. Yeah.
Also, I come back to my last, we had internal discussions of whether this should be a single choice or multiple choice question. I was for multiple choice because one can be more confused and still find it useful, or vice versa. But I was what do you call it, voted by others. So let's see, we're at 69% participation, now 70, maybe, let's see, it's still moving. So we'll have, yeah, and I think it's, let's see. Okay, so I would say let's share and let's have a look at it, all of us. So, Tim, what do you think?
I'm just thinking. I actually am thinking.
Yes.
I don't see it here. Hang on.
You don't see it yet?
No, it seems to have disappeared on my screen anyway.
Oh, well, maybe I can just give an impression. So there's a few people who find it more useful, as well as a few people who find it less useful now. That's interesting. And about the same number, it's always 7 or 8 people who are actually more confused than before. I would personally say that's not a bad thing, because confusion sometimes is encouragement to look back at things, but I don't want to judge that. there's a little more people, 24 out of 94, by the way, who find it actually more clearer, more accessible. And the highest number of people says the view has not changed at all. It's almost 30 people, which of course it doesn't have to. We hope it was still enlightening, and there will be an evaluation later on. And also almost 20 people who say they haven't made up their minds yet. And that's something I personally find understandable, because it is something that, yeah, it needs a little, as Amber said, Hirnschmalz, brain grease, to get the hands around. So, yeah, quite mixed result, but with the majorities in finding it clearer, or view has not changed, or haven't made up their minds yet. All right.
Well, it's interesting.
Can we stop share it, or do you see?
No, no. I want to. No, I think we're good. You know, I've been, as a diplomat and as a former co-chair, I was trained to ensure one always ends a meeting on a high note, on a positive note. And I think the fact that you know, the emphasis here seemed a large number of people, 35, found it helpful. That's good. We weren't meaning to change people's minds, so that's just fine. And I think people, the number, I think we still haven't lost that many participants, I think, on the webinar. So that's always a positive sign. And I'm very thankful that this will be evaluated after I've turned off my mic and my camera. But this has been truly a very, very stimulating and a really interesting and to some degree fun discussion on a very serious matter. I actually found it fascinating, and I'm very, very grateful to all four of you for finding the time and filling out the exercise, and then of course coming forth, as someone mentioned, bravely. And I think that's quite true, actually. And honestly, I really very much appreciate it, and I for one certainly have benefited from this session and from your views and your experience. So thank you so much. I think we're now going to move to some final remarks from Sue-Elle. And again, thanks a lot.
Yes, same from me. Thank you all very, very much. This was a very interesting discussion, and actually from the preparation, because of course these things take preparation, and all the discussions we had there to set this webinar up. Thank you very much for your availability, for your willingness to actually share the matrices, your mutual matrices, and share your thoughts and impressions here. With this, I'm ready to hand over to my colleague Suhail Al-Yanabi, also co-manager of the ABS initiative, and known by probably most of you, for a few final famous last words. Thank you, Suhail.
Yes, good afternoon, morning, day to all of you. And yeah, picking up on what Tim said, one should close on positive thinking and remarks. I think I can do that. I will firstly start off with the polls, which I found quite interesting. And maybe the key message was in poll 2, where the majority of the participants said it should be rather used as a multi-stakeholder discussion tool and a thinking instrument, and not only by an independent expert. So this is more or less now a task also for us, the initiative, others, to provide the space to let stakeholders discuss about the metrics. And although some 20% did not even have the time to look at it and to work on it, the majority did see usefulness in it, and so there is some positive vibes on that. And at least also with the third poll, although most said that the opinion has not changed, if we add that to those that find it more accessible, this is at least not a negative statement. And I'll take it as a encouragement indeed to, as I said, provide maybe some more discussion space on elements. And some highlights that I gathered from the meeting was that one way of maybe addressing it and approaching it is to pre-classify it to criteria that you do find most important, and that you could take it from there. But of course, some said dependent on with which option and criteria you start, it may influence also your thinking on others. And thinking generally was a big word here, thinking and reflecting. So how can one tackle it do it in a most unbiased way, so that one doesn't basically follow one stakeholder perspective, but to look at it from some set a common view and a common interest. And what is that? Is it in the realm of the CBD, how it best contributes then to the 3 CBD objective? Is this the policy option, the policy goal of it, and should that be even higher rated than other criteria? This is also what we heard, that one would need to highlight first maybe all relevant elements, and that in this regard some options may be scored lower than others. What I also liked is to put one in the shoes of the others. So this role play idea, Tim, maybe this is one of the ways forward. And then, of course, also that there is a need, of course, to seek a balance, that we mustn't stretch or lose the strings too much. So, but something needs to be in for all of us. And surely, technically, one of the challenging aspects is how to deal with monetary, with non-monetary benefits. So that certainly is something that also would need to be addressed in a further multi-stakeholder exchange. And that all may bring us then to the conclusion and to identify which of the option finally is going to be the toy that brings us the most pleasure for the longest amount of time. I as well found this webinar extremely interesting, and it was an entertaining and also mind-boggling talk show for me. I would like to encourage you now to also make use of the evaluation, and yes, also please don't hesitate then to come up with suggestions to the initiative. I'm quite sure, no, I'm very sure that this is not the last event of the initiative that will deal with the multi-criteria metrics and the different options. So thank you very much. And also thanks a lot for your endurance having followed this entire webinar.
Yes, thank you very much, Suhail. One thing perhaps to add is that, as with earlier webinars, this one, as you know, has been recorded, and we'll just basically cut out the very last end and what we discussed before and so forth. So there will not be anything substantial cut out, and it will be published soon. You will get information about this. And then if you found it useful and perhaps it has helped you to think some of the aspects through, then you might want to watch it or encourage colleagues to watch it and maybe take some inspiration from this. So thank you very much again, everybody, all the team, of course, especially our distinguished panelists, and Tim as panel facilitator, and all the participants who are still here and who have been here. Some seem to have had to leave already. Those who are still here and will leave in a moment, please stay and take this 1 minute, or I guess it takes not much longer, for the evaluation, which always helps us to improve our work. With this, I would say thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Goodbye. Thanks a lot.
And goodbye.
Moderator, panelists, thanks a lot.
Yes.
Facilitator.
Thank you.